Capitalism's counterargument to Marxism and communism. The second half of the 20th century was marked by the Cold War, which involved an ideological contest between capitalists and communists. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 after years of presenting deceptive statistics and figures to defend communism. China had to undertake a massive move towards free market systems in 1979 to create what is now branded as a Chinese model of socialism-communism. This model integrated some aspects of capitalism, although the country maintains a strong centralized system which is functioning fairly well. In this section, we examine the founding arguments of communism presented by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the late 1800s. It is these ideas and philosophical positions that were applied in the communist countries in the 20th century. This section is riddled with conflict. This is because the issues of ideological positions have always been subject to controversy and debate. Therefore, we must state that this is not absolute. It is a perspective presented by capitalist theorists who have studied the issues with the Communist Manifesto and why communist countries collapsed in 70 years, or simply had to modify a lot of its fundamental structures to survive. Gerald Cohen identifies that Marx presented capitalism as a problem. Marx only looked at the imperial version of capitalism that was applied in Europe and never got to critique the American model of capitalism, which has been proliferated in countries around the world today. Marx argued that in a capitalist society, the poor in society had no option but to sell their labor to the rich owners of business. The business owner only provided wages in return to the labor produced by the poor worker. This meant the worker was enslaved by the business owner and created conditions similar to slavery or serfdom, where people worked only for enough food to eat to survive. In this context, Marx sounded very much like Baron de Montesquieu, who presented the notion of the patria in his writings a century earlier. The patria was the ruler of the state who was entitled to the surpluses of everything that was produced by the worker, who was forced to live a frugal life by shunning luxury. It so happened that Marx was writing after the Industrial Revolution, and in place of the patria or big state, Marx attacked the new middle class who owned businesses after the Industrial Revolution. Marx never really examined the possibility of the big state or central authority acting as a patria, or becoming too powerful to be held accountable by the citizens. Marx only assumed that a revolution by the working class who oversaw the distribution of capital could end the exploitation by business owners. Gerald Cohen argues that capitalism's free market system allows the working class to experience some degree of unfairness in the short run. However, in the long run, a competitive free market system allowed the working class to also acquire capital, set up their own production systems, and become rich. In other words, if a state took capital from its workers, it had to limit their freedom because power will be vested in the state. And this means that production will be limited by the state and the free choice of the people would have to be restricted. The citizens would be free to do what the state requires of them. This is a very limited freedom. This only created by a big state that was going to become tyrannical in the long run. Therefore, the capitalist argument is that the individual's only way of achieving freedom is to be allowed to set goals, acquire capital, and use it to trade to realize their goals. This is the only way freedom can be guaranteed without any sumptuary laws of the state that requires the people to limit their aspirations. Cohen's argument is that the enemy to all people everywhere is the patria, an extremely powerful state who dictated how people should think and behave. The patria, or a big government, threatened people whether in a capitalist society and/or communist one. Therefore, Cohen concludes that Marx only had a superficial view of the true enemy of freedom. Marx only looked at what was happening in his generation and moved to attack the new generation of industrialists who were creating a better world where people could be free of an oppressive government. This is because capitalism created markets, and as long as the market was growing and had the potential to grow in an exponential manner, anyone including the exploited worker, could also acquire capital, set up their own businesses, create products, sell, and become rich. The communist society presented by Marx and Engels was to distribute wealth equally. Distributing wealth equally also meant distributing poverty equally. This means a communist government is bound to amass more power, force people to live as the government prescribed, and eventually use the same tyrannical methods of the patriarchal societies of Europe to control the people. This would inevitably lead to human rights abuses, state harms, and oppressive systems. After all, sharing wealth inevitably meant sharing poverty as well. Therefore, it is just a matter of when and not if the communist society would become tyrannical and worse than a capitalist one. From another angle, industrialization required two key things. Number one, markets, and number two, innovation. An industrialized nation needed to sell its products. Capitalism allowed the market to grow progressively and expand the production capacity, and also create the foundations for many producers. As the markets grew and more producers entered the market, innovation spiked, and this meant improving the products. With the incentive of gaining profits, companies invested in innovations and constantly improved the offerings for consumers. This was something that was conspicuously absent in a communist society. A communist society produced what was needed by the people, not what was profitable. The absence of the profitability motive meant the absence of an incentive to innovate and improve the products. Also, the absence of market meant the concept of consumer sovereignty is missing. The concept of consumer sovereignty is at the crux of capitalist ideology. Consumer sovereignty is the epitome of individual freedom in the capitalist society. This is the consumer's right to choose whichever product they wanted. This can only happen when there are free markets. A communist society cannot guarantee this because goods are produced not for the attainment of the central government's goals of distributing products fairly, rather than satisfying the needs of the market. Therefore, the communist government would progressively cut out the needs of the people by imposing its will on the production system. This would ultimately lead to tyranny. Finally, Gerald Cohen asserts that the free markets function without limitation to race, ethnicity, or demographic origins. Anyone can set up their own business, create products that would be bought by consumers if and only if the products meet their needs. Therefore, the free markets guarantee the rights of all citizens. In summary, the key arguments put forward by capitalism against communism are: Number 1. The biggest threat to the freedom of individuals is a big state that had centralized power that the individual citizen could not challenge. Number 2. Marx's communist thesis was simplistic because it was merely reactionary to the evils of the early industrialized society, which the tyrannical states of Europe could not challenge. Number 3. The argument that the working class and poor could come together and present a better approach towards the distribution of resources is shallow, because after a communist revolution, a big state would replace the old government, and the freedoms of the individuals will soon be overlooked. Number 4. A big state comes with a moral argument, and this leads to an unending demand for more rights and more authority, which would soon lead to tyranny. Number 5. Central planning is prescriptive and depends on the recommendations driven by the interests of leaders who have their own self-serving goals like self-preservation in order to stay in power. With time, such goals of the ruling elite would lead to the neglect of the needs of the individuals, and this would lead to hardship and poverty. Number 6. Sharing wealth also means sharing poverty, and this would ultimately deny the strong in society the basic rights to pursue their goals and needs, because the state will prescribe the ceiling of what they can do. Thus, the strong must live like the weak, and the weak with potential will never actualize it, because a strong state decides for everyone. Number 7. The free markets create some difficulties and hardship for the working class, but it also gives them the chance to own assets and build business, that would ultimately bring them prosperity like their employers. Number 8. The doctrine of consumer sovereignty is the greatest level of freedom. A person's ability to determine what to buy with their money is the greatest source of freedom. Number 9. The markets of a capitalist society allow the aggregation of the greatest needs of consumers, who are allowed to choose freely. This means the producers can find the greatest needs of consumers and use the least resources and most sophisticated technology to produce goods that meet the greatest needs of the people. This is in contrast with the communist society, which is driven by a central authority that prescribes what the people need. They have a limited way of forecasting consumers' true needs, which can best be signified by what they spend their money on freely. Thus, with time, they will lose touch with realities and impose things upon the citizens, which contravenes their individual freedoms and rights. Number 10. A free market with proper safeguards will avoid oligopoly, promote free entry and free exit, and allow anyone and everyone to gain the opportunity to set up businesses, trade, and become successful. This is the exact opposite of the capitalist society that Karl Marx witnessed.